Grendel has recently been reworked, making his kit more fluid and more powerful to use. Let's dive into what he's now capable of, how the stats scale beyond what the game shows you, and how you can build him to make full use of that. I'm Nick Engineer, let's solve a practical problem. Each of Grendel's abilities have quite a bit going on, far more than just what the text states on the ability card. So there's timestamps in the description if you're looking for information on a specific ability. While you're down there, you can also check out my Patreon for even more detail behind the scenes. Grendel's first ability is Feast. On cast, Grendel opens up his stomach and attempts to swallow any enemy he's aiming at within range. There's a very narrow cone on this ability, so you do need to actually aim at the enemies to scoop them up. If an enemy is held by another ability, or immune to hard crowd control, such as due to overguard, then it cannot be swallowed. While swallowed, enemies appear on Grendel's unique UI, indicating the type of consumed unit and how much health or shields they have remaining. Their hit points will drain at 2% of max per second, meaning each enemy will be killed in at most 50 seconds. Usually this will be quicker still, as you can swallow enemies that are already damaged, and deal additional damage to them through Grendel's other abilities. In order to keep Grendel at full capacity then, will require swallowing more than 5 enemies per 50 seconds, and they usually won't all conveniently die at the same time. Since the rework, swallowed enemies have no drain on Grendel himself, and instead they provide a 250 armor bonus per enemy in his gut, up to a max of 1250 armor. Considering Grendel only has a base 350 armor, even a couple of enemies can make a substantial difference to his defenses. Grendel can freely expel all enemies from his gut at any time by hold casting Feast. This explosively dumps any remaining enemies in front of Grendel, dealing damage in an 8 meter long cone to them and other enemies in the area. The damage according to the UI is 500 toxin and modified by your strength. However, it is also modified by the total enemy level of the units you are ejecting. With the exception of the very first level on one enemy, every enemy level per unit increases the damage by 1/15. Basically, this means that with 5 enemies swallowed, you deal 1/3 extra damage per level of the enemies. For 5 level 30 enemies, this means roughly 10 times the damage, and for 5 level 100 enemies, it's over 33 times the damage. This damage also forces a toxin status effect, dealing even more damage over time. Compared to enemy hit points, this is an incredible amount of scaling. Unarmored enemies outside of the steel path will either die outright or be killed by the toxin proc from this ability. Onto the steel path, it's less effective due to the health bonus, but it can still carve through the majority of hit points on most units so long as they have no armor. There are a couple downsides to this damage however. The cone is both short and narrow and cannot be boosted by range mods, making it hard to apply this damage very widely. Also, dumping out the enemies also means losing all of Grendel's armor bonus and the fuel needed for Grendel's other abilities. It's a capable damage dealer, but the application is poor and frankly a bit cumbersome. You can augment Feast with the Gourmand augment. This will remove the energy cost of casting it, instead draining 200 health with every feast. On top of this, the armor bonus per enemy climbs from 250 each to 400 each, giving you a maximum bonus of 2000 armor. Without any other armor modifiers on Grendel, this means your max damage reduction from armor climbs from 84.2% to 88.7%. That may not sound like a lot to you, and well, you'd be right. This change effectively reduces the damage taken with 5 swallowed enemies by a little over 28%, or less if you have any other armor bonuses. It's an improvement, but it's not much of an improvement. As for switching from an energy cost to a health cost, it's a matter of preference, but it's really not needed. Grendel can amplify his energy gain already with his next ability I'm about to cover, which means that the cast cost of Feast really isn't an issue like it was pre-rework. This augment also removes the ability to shield gate with casts of Feast, further impacting Grendel's survival. So you can use the augment if it suits your build, but I don't really rate it that highly now. As a final note on Feast, swallowed enemies are effectively removed from the game, so any auras they have don't function whilst they're swallowed, and they don't count to objectives such as delaying the end of a defense wave. Onto Grendel's second ability, and the one he provides to the Helminth system, we have Nourish. Nourish is a buffing ability that requires a swallowed enemy for Grendel to be able to use it, but not for other Warframes. When cast, Grendel removes 20% of the max hit points of the first swallowed enemy in his gut. This will heal Grendel for 1000 health, and applies a buff to him and his nearby allies, adding 75% viral damage to weapons, and increasing the energy gain from all sources by 100%. This energy buff includes Energy Orbs, Zenoric's Wellspring, Energy Siphon Aura, Trinity's Energy Vampire, and so on, all sources. All of these values are affected by strength, increasing the damage to the swallowed enemy, the healing, the viral buff, and the energy gain buff. Nourish also applies a defensive buff. If you or an affected ally are damaged by an enemy, then all enemies within 12 meters are staggered and receive viral procs with a small amount of viral damage. It's 10 procs if Nourish is cast by Grendel, or 1 viral proc if it's cast by a different Warframe. This viral stagger feature has a brief cooldown on it, so it doesn't spam out multiple procs if there's some enemies with high rate of fire weapons. It's no overstatement to say that this ability is a huge amount of sustain for Grendel. With 5 swallowed enemies for armor, and the adaptation mod at full 90% damage reduction, Nourish will provide over 60,000 effective healing in a single cast, which can be further increased by strength. The stagger on nearby enemies helps to reduce the incoming damage, the viral procs makes it easier to kill nearly all enemies, and the energy gain enhancement allows Grendel to liberally apply his abilities. With 200% strength, easily achieved these days, all energy income is tripled. Zenoric's Wellspring alone will be giving you 15 energy per second on Grendel. Zenoric's passive also double dips on the Nourish bonus, as Nourish will increase the energy gain from the orb before Zenoric passive triggers, and then increases the energy over time gain from that passive effect. At 200% strength, this means a single energy orb will grant 75 energy up front, and then an additional 112 energy over 5 seconds, for a total of 187 energy. So when I say this is a huge amount of sustain, turning what would normally be 37 energy into 187 is exactly what I'm talking about. Further to this, weapon builds made specifically to work with Nourish can completely do away with modding for viral, opening up spaces for direct damage types such as corrosive or radiation, status modding such as going for toxin or heat, or doubling down on other stats such as more crits or attack speed. As Nourish is pure viral rather than a combination of cold and toxin to make viral, it doesn't override the cold or toxin damage you'll have on a weapon already, allowing you to apply their effects at the same time. Nourish also has an augment, which is Hearty Nourishment, and this will cleanse the status effects from Grendel and give status immunity for 5 seconds per swallowed enemy, up to a base maximum of 25 seconds. That 25 seconds is the same as the duration on Nourish, and both of these are affected by ability duration, meaning that with 5 swallowed enemies, you can constantly match your status immunity to the duration remaining on Nourish. This augment, however, has no effects if you use it on another Warframe, including not removing active status effects. So if you're looking for this kind of effect on a different frame, probably you want to use Rolling Guard instead. Grendel's third ability used to be his fourth, and that's Pulverize, aka Meatball mode. Previously, you needed to have a swallowed enemy to cast this ability, but now it's more flexible. With no swallowed enemies, it's free to cast, and then drains 3 energy per second whilst active. However, if you have any number of enemies swallowed, then the ability is completely free to cast. While in Meatball mode, Grendel is unable to use any weapons or Helminth abilities, he's unable to carry objects, and has an altered movement system. He can roll around with decent control and speed, or sprint to go faster but with worse control. You still retain the ability to do double jumps, and strangely enough you can also wall jump, but you can't wall latch. While Grendel is quite restricted in this mode, he can still cast his other 3 default abilities to go alongside it. On activating Meatball form, Grendel also gains 200 hit points per second, and this scales down to 100 hit points per second over the first few seconds. In contrast to the healing, the enemies in Grendel's gut take additional damage whilst Pulverize is active. It's only 25 hit points per second though, which onto higher levels isn't really going to matter. As Grendel rolls around, he collides with enemies forcefully, ragdolling them and dealing a modest amount of damage. The damage is 500 plus 300 per swallowed enemy to a max of 2000 before ability stats. The radius of this impact of his Meatball gets larger with more swallowed enemies, making it easier to hit enemies by rolling around. Alternatively, Grendel can jump or fall to slam into the ground and deal damage in an AoE. This damage once again scales with swallowed enemies, dealing a base of 150 damage and 70 extra damage with each swallowed enemy. The range on the slam also increases with swallowed enemies from a base of 5 meters whilst empty to 15 meters whilst full. Due to enemy level scaling, the damage from both direct hits and ground slams falls off rather quickly, beginning to fail to kill basic units by the end of the star chart. And so once you're onto Steel Path, it's basically meaningless damage at that point. To help it remain relevant at higher tiers, Pulverize also provides an armor reduction effect. Every time Grendel deals damage with the Meatball, either by direct hits or by slamming the ground, all affected enemies lose 50% of their maximum armor permanently, and this is modified by his strength. With 5 enemies swallowed, this means you can use no energy to go into Meatball form and either slam twice, or just once with 200% strength, to remove all armor in a 15 meter radius. As the radius is affected by your ability range, you can take this even higher. As Grendel can cast his other abilities whilst in Meatball form, you can continuously consume new enemies to maintain the range and no energy drain, as well as cast Nourish to help heal, restore energy, and deliver viral procs. Pulverize also comes with an augment, which is Catapult, and this one can actually go into the Excellence slot. This allows you additional movement in Meatball mode by expending 5 energy for a surge of speed. At any point during the speed boost, you can hold crouch to very rapidly lose the momentum to regain more normal control at will. This augment is purely about quality of life. You can use it if you want to, but there's no build that it's critical for. And then the last of Grendel's abilities, we have Regurgitate. Before his rework, this ability was his third, and it was free to cast so long as you had an enemy consumed, but it had fewer features. Now, Regurgitate costs 50 energy to cast, launching a swallowed enemy as a ragdoll projectile. On collision with another enemy or a surface, the projectile deals AoE toxin damage with a guaranteed proc to itself and all enemies within 6 meters. Affected enemies are temporarily slowed, and crucially, they have 75% of their armor stripped in the process. The armor strip is modified by strength, and this strip happens before the damage is applied, giving you a greater effect from the attack. Once again, the damage on this ability is not a fixed value. At base it deals 2000 toxin damage, modified by your strength. On top of this, however, it also deals extra damage equal to 10% of the current hit points of the launched enemy. The conversion from enemy hit points to damage is not affected by strength, so you are locked to that 10%. For example, an enemy with 10,000 hit points remaining would make for a 3,000 damage projectile, or if you had 200% strength, it would be a 5,000 damage projectile. As toxin procs last for 6 seconds and deal 50% of the base damage per second, the total damage delivered is 4 times the initial hit damage. The scaling on this isn't as strong as the scaling from Holdcasting Feast, as it's tied to current enemy hit points rather than the enemy level. So enemies which have been swallowed for some time or otherwise were already damaged will make for weaker projectiles, but they'll still deliver the full armor strip effect. As far as armor strip abilities go, this is one of the highest base values, requiring only a small increase in strength for total armor strip. The downside, however, is it requires swallowing an enemy first, it gives up some of your armor bonus from Feast when you get rid of said enemy, and it has one of the smallest effective areas with only a 6 meter radius. For comparison, Terrify has a 60% armor strip and reaches out to a range of 15 meters at base. On the plus side though, it's only 50 energy to cast, and combined with Grendel's Nourish, that's even less of a concern. Aside from Grendel's abilities, his base stats are noteworthy too. His base health is the 3rd highest in the game, behind only Inaros and Inaros Prime. His base armor is a bit less impressive at 350 at level 30, but his innate ability to increase that to 1600 without mods is still quite strong. As a result, he's capable of health tanking pretty handily. On top of this, Grendel has the lowest non-zero shield pool of any Warframe at just 75. With a Decaying Dragon Key, this puts him at just 18.75 shields. With 2 Auger mods or Brief Respite in the Aura slot, that's enough to fully restore his shields from any ability cast at 100% efficiency, with the exception of Pulverize because it has no cost. This makes Grendel one of the most effective shield gating frames in the entire game, especially considering his ability to improve on energy gains from all sources. So not only can he consume enemies, stagger them and ragdoll them, he can also choose to health tank, shield gate tank, or both simultaneously. Which brings us on to the matter of actually building Grendel to use these options. The first build I have for you is designed as a more forgiving to use build, having neutral efficiency to keep energy costs in line. We've got enhanced strength, range and duration to make effective use of Grendel's entire kit, as well as natural talent making casts of Nourish and Pulverize significantly faster, and Prime sure-footed to handle those pesky knockdowns. With this build, we have an armor strip of 95% with Pulverize in combination with Corrosive Projection before any additional buffs come into play. When Archon Intensify triggers, or after 42 kills thanks to Molt Augmented, Pulverize will be up to a complete armor strip. With an enemy in Grendel's gut, this means you can quickly jump into Meatball mode, do a quick jump and slam, and then return to normal mode, having armor stripped everything within up to 26 meters for 0 additional energy cost. The combination of auger mods, adaptation and vitality means Grendel tanks through both shield gating and health tanking. While it's not necessary for most content, you can use the Decaying Dragon Key to maximise the shield gate value that Grendel gets along with this setup. As Grendel is able to take a lot of hits this way, the second Arcane can be Arcane Avenger for its incredible critical boost to all weapons, which goes a very long way. This build only requires 2 V polarities, Formidant's Archon Continuity and Archon Intensify, although I have a third V polarity on Natural Talent for the high intensity build I'll show you in just a moment. As ever with most builds, the difference between Archon and Prime Continuity is a matter of preference and availability. The Archon version is giving you corrosive procs when you hold cast Feast or use Regurgitate, but all it's really adding is a proc for Condition Overload in those cases. Archon Intensify is also optional versus normal Intensify, but it is more impactful. If Grendel heals himself with Nourish, Archon Intensify will grant you 30% extra strength for 10 seconds, affecting the armor strip on Pulverize, the viral and energy bonuses on Nourish, and the healing on Nourish and Pulverize, as well as the damage on all 4 abilities. So it's nice to have, but not absolutely necessary all told. If you don't have or want Prime Sure-Footed, you can instead fill the extra slot with your choice of Catapult for more mobility and Pulverize, Cunning Drift for more range, or Power Drift to hit total armor strip on Pulverize immediately at the mission start. For a more budget build with no forma, you can drop Prime Sure-Footed and downgrade to normal continuity and intensify. Including Power Drift would still be a good idea for that total armor strip, as if you're going for a budget build, I imagine you also won't have Molt Augmented. Switching over to our other core build, we have one that's a little more intensive. We've swapped out Adaptation and Vitality, doing away with all health tanking entirely. Instead, this build relies on shield gating and rolling guard to stay alive. Grendel's impressive energy generation means we can get away with low efficiency from Blind Rage, which also then allows us to use Overextended for a substantial bonus to our range. From the start, this build applies a 96% armor reduction via Pulverize, very rapidly reaching the 100% mark with just 34 kills or any healing cast of Nourish. Again, both Archon mods can be exchanged for their variants if you so wanted, with minimal overall impact on this setup. With shield gating, you don't really want to be taking constant damage unless you burn through all of your energy, meaning that Arcane Avenger wouldn't trigger as often by default. We can instead swap that out for Arcane Nullifier to protect against Energy Leech Xmas and other magnetic procs. Alternatively, you can apply an Aura Forma and open up the Aura to Combat Discipline to damage yourself and activate Arcane Avenger that way. For my pick though, I've gone for the Enemy Radar Aura as a general handy tool, though you can use Energy Siphon for constant energy gain, and that's again buffed by Nourish, or you can go for Corrosive Projection. If you do, you no longer need Molt Augmented to get yourself to that key breakpoint of total armor strip and Pulverize, so you could switch out that Arcane slot for any other preference really. The idea with this build is that again, each of Grendel's 1, 2 and 4 abilities will fully restore shields and allow Grendel to hold out even in harsher missions. The added range allows for armor strip on Pulverize to reach just shy of 40 meters with every slam, which for a 0 energy ability is exceedingly good. If you want to go budget on this build, remove Prime Sure-Footed will remove the need for 2 forma, and if you downgrade to normal intensify, you can get away with a 0 forma approach for this build. It all comes down to how much you value the utility of not being knocked down, which, at least in the case of a shield gating build, is usually a good idea to have. For both of these builds, the Helminth options for Grendel are numerous. There's the default obvious choices of Gloom for crowd control, or any of Eclipse, Roar and Breach Surge if you want damage buffs. You can use Silence to shut down enemy abilities, like the rotating barriers on Guardian Xmas and Heat Waves from Arson Xmas. Alternatively still, you can use Eurydice Aquablades to give you a subsume damage option that stays active whilst you're in Meatball mode, although the augment doesn't seem to work properly whilst you're rolling around. It's entirely up to you whether you choose to subsume over Grendel's 3 or 4. His 3 is a cheaper and wider reaching armor strip, whilst his 4 allows for armor strip and damage at a distance with a smaller break in general flow. As for Archon Shards, there are a few good options for Grendel. On the Azure Shards, Grendel can benefit from additional energy max. He doesn't need a whole lot, but it can give an extra energy reserve to allow you to spam a little more freely with his abilities. Otherwise, you can give him a bit of extra armor, but that's really about it on the Azures. For the Amber Shards, Grendel can benefit from additional casting speed, allowing you to remove natural talent on the first build. You could give Grendel extra energy orb effectiveness, but Nourish should be more than enough for that already honestly. With the Crimson Shards, you can use ability strength to reach those armor strip breakpoints without needing Archon Intensify or Molt Augmented. Otherwise, ability duration or weapon crits will be the best options there to just get more out of your loadout. Implementing all of this, you'll have yourself a Warframe that is resilient and destructive, while also providing a solid amount of support to his allies through Nourish. He's not so strong for defensive missions, and he's certainly not a stealth frame, but Grendel is plenty competitive when it comes to missions like Exterminate and Survival. As ever, if you've learned something new, make sure to subscribe to catch more as it goes live. Once again, a thank you to those of you who support on the channel one way or another, and as always, consume enemies, become Meatball, and fight well, Tenno.